There's a morning that's coming. It arrives like any other morning, the same light, the same sounds of the house or the street, the same body waking into the same life. But something is different. The thing that used to be there first isn't there. Or maybe it's there, but it's quieter, much quieter. You notice at some point that you've been awake for 15 minutes and you haven't once thought about what you're going to have to manage today. The air has a different quality, and it's not a dramatic breakthrough. It's an ordinary quality of a morning that simply is, and you are simply in it. You notice there is more of you available, not a version of you that has held on to everything. Just you present with whatever the day is about to hold. Today on the Ask Dr. Gill podcast, I want to talk about the changes that happen and what they look like as you're healing, because I think this is something that is often missed in the discussion in healing. So stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Ask Dr. Gill. I am your host, Dr. Gill Winkleman. And today on the podcast, I want to talk about how healing happens and what it looks like. Because I think we have a lot of discussion about what the problems are, but what does it look like if things are going well? And, it's really interesting to me to think about this in terms of my career and kind of what I've done. We often focus on what is wrong, what is out of balance, instead of talking about what does health look like. And today we're going to talk about physical and mental health aspects, because I think there's aspects in the nervous system that are really important to cover. And they don't necessarily show up in a way that we normally think about in medicine. And I'll explain as we get further along. So let's talk about the body first, because I think that the physiological changes are the ones that sometimes surprise people. And what I think is interesting is oftentimes I have patients coming in for something, say, anxiety. And they suddenly notice that the stomach ache that had been there their whole life isn't there anymore. And it's not the thing that is like so bad that they need to take something for it. It's just that sense in their stomach and it's gone. And that's one of the things that I think is kind of interesting, and that's the piece that I'm talking about. Let's talk first about sleep, because sleep is one of those things that is really easy or really hard to treat. Oftentimes when people wake, either in the morning or in the middle of the night, they sense this low-grade anxiety, and it registers as soon as they wake up. And I've had patients who have dreaded bedtime, and as the healing happens, they notice they didn't even know they dreaded bedtime. They notice that they're not worried about going to bed. That's usually what it is. Or they stop calculating how tired they're going to feel the next day. And what I noticed is sometimes when I started sleeping better, like I stopped thinking about how I was going to feel the next day. It's not that necessarily, if you have sleep issues, this. It's not that every night is perfect. It's that that if you have a bad night, that you're going to be fine the next day and you're going to sleep well the next night. And that's the part of healing that I think we often miss. It's like we don't think about how the replenishment is happening and how good we feel. We often are just focused on how bad we feel. And so or how poor the night's sleep was. So now the baseline is one of the hardest things to describe because it's noticing an absence of something that was there. And there's an old Sherlock Holmes story about, I think it's the Hounds of Baskerville, and he solves the crime because of what wasn't there. And this is often what healing is like. It's what isn't there. And it's the thing that you don't notice, right? It's like when your knee stops hurting, you don't notice it. You notice when your knee is hurting, but you often don't notice when your knee stops hurting. And that's what I'm talking about. And this becomes subtler in the more psychological and nervous system realms. And I'll give you an example. There are people I've worked with who have such a strong level of hypervigilance. They don't even realize that they're scanning the room constantly for threats. And I don't mean just sort of noticing your surroundings. I mean like being on edge. I remember someone who would never sit somewhere with their back to the door. They always wanted to know where the exit is and how they could escape the situation in any moment. And they grew up in a very abusive household, so it makes sense. When that stops, that chronic alertness stops, that bracing stops, that's recovery. And oftentimes people report that they didn't even realize they were doing it until it stopped. And they were like, wow, I was really chill and relaxed. What's that about? So that's something that's really interesting that I see. The other area that I'd like to talk about is digestion. And when this begins to settle, this is often a sign of nervous system recovery. And it's not, a lot of people are surprised by this, and it's often mentioned in passing that, someone might say, oh, I haven't taken any like antacids in the last couple of weeks, or they find that they're having regular bowel movements that are normal every day or twice a day, and they've never done that in their lives. Now, what's interesting and what I want to point out is I treat digestive issues, and that is something that we work with, right? But what I'm talking about is when I'm working with someone on something else, such as their anxiety, and that the digestive issues then, resolve. That's a really interesting aspect of this. And, digestion is an interesting one anyway, because oftentimes, unless it's really bad, people don't notice because most people don't know what healthy digestion is, to be honest. I mean, that has been my experience. And there's so much variation in terms of the literature as well. But I think we're getting to a standard place of that. And maybe I'll do a podcast about that one day or write an article about it. The point is that people as the nervous system starts to recover, they start to have better access to healthier digestion. And they also tend to make better food choices as well, which is interesting. So the other piece is recovery. What I've noticed is people's recovery pace, let's say, changes. And this is both physical, by the way, and emotional. So, and I'll give you two examples, one of each. So from the physical is when there's less stress in the system, the body can heal more easily, right? When the body is in sympathetic mode, the healing mechanisms are not working optimally. And when we go into a parasympathetic state, the body begins to be able to recover more easily. And so that definitely happens. And likewise, psychologically, what I find is that those things that you used to ruminate about over and over and over again for days, hours, days, you let it go faster. You're like, oh, the nervous system just completes it and you're done. And what used to take 10 hours takes 30 minutes. That's a shift that happens, and often people don't recognize it. So I'm highlighting this so you can see it and see if this is true for you. Now, the other area that I want to talk about is relationships, because when we are healing, there's less, I'll say, cost in relationships. It's not that everything runs, perfectly. It's not that, everything is effortless or that you've changed the people in your life, although sometimes it is a factor of changing the people in your life. But what I'm talking about is that internal monitoring, that thing that you're doing within yourself, maybe within a particular person's presence or preparing to have a conversation that or processing it after it, that piece decreases. And, maybe as an example, maybe you're having a conversation and you say something that's maybe a little more honest than you usually allow. And you stay present for the response instead of scanning for the damage from what you said. And, you just notice that, right? That's the piece of the nervous system healing. And oftentimes, this takes time for the evidence to accumulate. In other words, at some point, you begin to realize you finish the conversation and you're not replaying it. Or you receive something, a compliment, attention, care, and you allowed it in. And it's maybe not all the way, but there's more that you allowed in than you previously allowed. And this is the beginning of this allowing and this loosening that happens. And, another example is you express a need without having to go through a rehearsal or making a pre-apology about what it is. You just say, hey, this is what I need. This is a sign of healing and you're taking up space and you're living your life. And I'm not talking about, the narcissistic type of, oh, people have to do this for me to heal. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the simple things that we do and in terms of occupying our lives. There's a morning, and it's just a usual morning, nothing special about it, ceremony about it, when you notice that you spent the previous day and never once apologized for your existence. And when it's going on, you don't notice it. You notice it after the fact. And lastly, there's a shift that arrives with an unexpected recognition, which maybe you realize the fear you've always called yours sounds exactly like a voice you grew up around. And you recognize that maybe this isn't mine. And your relationship to that begins to change. Now, the weight may not vanish right away, but you begin working with it rather than being worked by it. I don't know if that makes sense. It's often very subtle, this piece. It's like, it's that voice that you've heard as a child, and it may be like before you were 5, so you may not remember a specific incident, by the way. But there begins to be a separation from your identifying with that part of yourself and realizing, oh, maybe this isn't me. And that begins to change that experience. And that is part of the healing process, by the way. I'm going to take a quick break. And on the other end of the show, I'm going to talk about what changes in ordinary moments. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Ask Dr. Gill. I am your host, Dr. Gill Winkleman. So today we're talking about what healing looks like. Let's talk about ordinary moments. For example, you send an email and you don't reread it 10 times before sending it. You just make a decision without, making a big deliberation about it. You just do it. Or maybe you rest without feeling like you have to earn it, or you go have fun without feeling like you have to earn it. It's the Sunday afternoon that used to require justification, the list of things that you should be doing, isn't contaminated by guilt. You're just still, and you just have a quiet, simple afternoon where you enjoy yourself. It's not something that we often recognize when it happens. And oftentimes people feel like they have to make a justification, right? That isn't it's what's happening is you just do it. You don't make the justification. Another example is the no that required days of preparation before it comes out. Sometimes it just comes out and it's not perfect or without discomfort, but there's nothing that you needed to do prepping to do that. You just said no. And then it's over. And then you realize, oh, that wasn't so bad. That's the nervous system beginning to let go of whatever that is that you're holding on to that prevents you from being in the moment, being present with yourself and others. And that's the piece that I think is really interesting. Because when we're outside of that hypervigilance, we're just present with what is, with ourselves, with the people we love, people around us. And that's the piece that I think is interesting that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. It's like you wake up and you don't necessarily grab your phone right away or think about your to-do list. Sometimes it's just remembering your dreams, right? Whatever it is, you just notice where you are, notice the stillness. And there's more of you available in the present. The changes that prove something that shifted are often the ones you weren't necessarily watching for, the ones you noticed by accident. And I'll give you one more example. That comes from this week. I had a patient mention to me that he had started a new job, and he said, "Yeah, I'm thinking I should be anxious about things because I don't know if I know what I'm doing, but my body isn't responding that way. It's completely relaxed." And so it was really interesting, and we had a conversation about that. And that's the piece, I think, that's really interesting to me in terms of how we hold on to the ideas that we have about ourselves in these situations. And so I think it's important to recognize the shifts that happen so that you don't fall back into the role that you've played for so long. And so I think that's an important piece here. So I'm going to ask you a question to think about, which is, what would an ordinary Tuesday look like if your baseline had shifted? Nothing extraordinary, nothing, there's not a breakthrough, but the one in 3 weeks that is no particular significance. The morning, the work, the evening, the thing before sleep, not what you would accomplish, but what would be there? What would be? Most people don't recognize the first change because it doesn't feel dramatic. It's really ordinary. And that's why they don't often realize that things are shifting until they look back. And that Tuesday that I just mentioned isn't a fantasy. It's a direction. And the work in this series has been describing the signal framework, the incomplete process, the nervous system settings, the patterns that arrived before you did. And it's the work that gets you there, not through transformation, through the accumulation of conditions that allows the nervous system to update. And that's the piece, like with this patient, his nervous system was updating, his mind hadn't updated yet. The distance between where you are and that ordinary Tuesday might be real, but there's a path through to it, right? And 6 months later, someone may ask how you're doing, and you begin listing the small things. You're sleeping better. You stop replaying conversations. You're laughing more. Maybe you're singing more in the shower. And halfway through the conversation, you realize, wow, I'm doing a lot better than I was 6 months ago. And that's the breakthrough, right? That is the breakthrough. And I have a offering that I'm putting together called Rewrite the Signal, and that's exactly what it's designed to create. It's designed to help people transform their lives in these small moments and have the skills to recognize that as well. There's a link in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you next time.